All right, gang, let's talk about what we're at right now. All right, we're saying that we've configured our connections. We're established either to the console port or to a telnet or secure shell port. We've run through the initialization wizard. So we've got a host name, we've got a basic IP address to manage it wired, might be hooked up with SNMP. So we're in a good place there. Now, what else are we going to need to do? What are our post initialization tasks? Well, this is where we actually get into some of the basic setup that's going to be used to configure our wireless LAN controller in a converged environment. So one of those things is defining our role. So remember that in some cases, I'm going to have a very simple situation. I've got access points that are then connected to a switch which has the wireless control module built into it, like a 3850. And so in that environment, this guy's going to run as both the mobility controller and the mobility agent. It's very small scale. However, if I have multiple 3850s running out there, and I want to centralize that mobility controller role, then I might put a 5760 out here, which, by the way, can also work in conjunction with things like a 5508 LAN controller, right? That has been updated. I think it's version 7.3, so we're working our way up here. So in all of these cases, the mobility agent is running at this plane, and I centralize the functions of the mobility controller up here. So is it localized or is it remote? That's the question. And the command is very straightforward. In the global configuration mode, you'll enter the command wireless mobility controller if you're localizing it all to a single locale, right? This box, this particular 3850, let's say, is the wireless mobility controller and agent all in one thing. But if it is going to be more than that, let me show you down here, wireless mobility controller IP 192.168.11.252 as an example. I'm pointing to a remote IP address. That's the IP address of that 5760, of that centralized mobility controller that I've defined in my environment. So now I'm just a mobility agent. I'm just handling those aspects of managing the roaming, whereas the mobility controller is handling that in a centralized fashion. Okay, now that's one aspect. What else do we need to do in terms of post-configuration? One aspect is going to be licensing. When we talk about licensing, of course, we're concerned about making sure that we have the right licensing in place. So you can do show license right to use summary if you just want to see what your license currently is. So again, do you have a permanent license, the built-in license for IP services? Are you working with an access-based license that's limited in a certain amount? What functionality do you currently have on this controller? And then you can actually install licenses with the license command in global configuration, license right to use, and then activate, for example, IP services. And then you can go from there with various different license types that you might use. One that you might use if you are trying to figure out what license package do I need is, of course, the evaluation license. So you just put in that next, evaluation, all, and accept the EULA. And so that would actually set you up on a device to use the evaluation license locally and try out all the features, the mobility features, everything else, and see if it's worth it. And then you can come back and put in a different license if necessary. Okay, let's look then at the rest of the setup. So configuring an SVI should be pretty familiar for any of you that have worked with switches before. So interface into the SVI, a virtual interface for a VLAN, IP address, define it. So basically, you now can participate in VLAN 11 communication. Of course, that means you will also want to define VLAN 11 as a VLAN object to be able to work with. That'll be necessary as well. And if you want to further configure this environment to be able to support that communication, then, so at a switch level, you support VLAN 11, you have an interface VLAN 11, and then another aspect is defining it as the wireless management interface. So you've got the wired management interface and the wireless. So I could say here 11, right, as the VLAN ID that I'm using in this situation. Wireless management interface 11. So I can now be accessed wirelessly through 192.168.11.254 to manage this device. So that's a way that we can support that configuration. DHCP, of course, will need to manage support for DHCP as well, just like you would for anything else. So here's a management pool for the access points to be able to communicate with this. You can define that default router within that DHCP pool so they know how to function from that point. All right. And then for the interfaces that are connected to access points, if I want to further configure that, we would come in and do something like this. Interface, maybe gigabit 103, and then from there, description converged, switch port access VLAN 11, switch port mode access. So defining that as an access port that can communicate with the access points. So access point to wireless LAN controller on this particular port. I've defined that, and now I'm managing it using that configuration. Addition to that, a couple of other things you might want to keep in mind might be necessary to set up a VLAN trunking protocol. Remember, you may have multiple switches. You've defined these VLANs. It's important that everyone know about the same VLANs. You often will have VLANs that are specific to just your wireless environment, so you're going to want to make sure that you support VTP in most situations. Network time protocol, you want all your configurations to be stable, consistent, timestamp, certificates don't give you any grief, all that. So network time protocol is good there as well. And again, if you're supporting routing, because again, we can support layer 3 services on this, then you may well need to put in things like a default route. So IP route 0.0.0.0, and then point to the next hop router. So that might be 192.168.11.1, or it might be a completely different VLAN, might be 50.1, whatever that IP address might be, that is the next hop router. Remember that if you are running routing services, use the IP route command. If, however, you are just functioning as an access layer switch with no layer 3 configuration in there, then it's IP default-gateway, and then point to the next hop router, 192.168.11.50, or whatever that IP address would be, to say, here's how you get off this network onto something else. So those two commands are parallel, but if I'm functioning as a router in addition to a switch, I need IP route. If I'm functioning just as a client, like any other network client, then I use the IP default gateway command. Okay, now most of this stuff can be done using the graphical interface, but what we wanted to show here is the commands that you would use and some of the things to keep in mind as far as working with the CLI, because this can be scripted, this can be automated, this can be simplified for you for most switches if you are consistent, because of course you can load these commands straight out of a text file.